Hi everyone, welcome. Welcome to all E's and ISMTE members to this collaborative session. Megan McDevitt was planning to be here today to represent ISMTE, but she was called away at the last minute, unfortunately, so she can't join us. So you're left with me, myself, Duncan Nicholas, past president of E's, to welcome you and to host today's session. But now, without further ado, I shall pass you over to Jason Roberts to talk to us about editorial reports. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Duncan. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk at quite a pace today, but these slides, I believe, are available to anyone who attends today, and I wrote them purposefully in a way that you can use them after the fact, because there's a lot of information I could convey right now. I could probably spend all day talking about this, and I just want to give you a little highlight of the way that you should think and approach your reporting that you do within an editorial office. And I'm not just going to focus on peer review reports. There'll be some other things I'm going to suggest that you could look at. First of all, my conflict. So I'm the senior partner at Origin Editorial. We're an editorial office services provider. We do actually have a tool called Origin Reports, which was an internal reporting tool that we built because we really didn't like the reporting offers that we had from the editorial management system. It is commercially available. I do use a few screenshots from it, but I'm not talking about it at all today. I'm just talking about anything that you could be doing using Excel, paper and pen, whatever, however you generate your reports. So why should you care? Let's leap right into it. Well, the handling of performance metrics, I think it's actually something or other that editorial offices don't do a good job of. So in many cases, that's because a lot of us, we're not statistically inclined. Many people have English majors and things like that if they're working in the editorial office. So it's hard, and it's not helped by the fact that the data that we work with is not easy to manipulate. It's not always clear what was recorded or why it was recorded the way it was recorded. And it requires a lot of thinking on our part. It's time consuming, and for most people, it becomes a burden. But there is a considerable amount of data that we have at our fingertips, particularly in the editorial management systems, but also with the data that the publishers give us. And so, that often lies untouched, and we might be missing a trick or two by not exploring it. You can make operational decisions based on the data that we have. So it's not just this is how many submissions we had and this is how long it took to make a decision. You could be making very clear policy and protocol decisions based on behavioral patterns that you can detect in the data. So editorial offices typically use data in three ways. They monitor progress, so that's lifetime reporting that you might be doing. You also measure your performance. You might audit your performance. And that might be delivered in the form of an editorial board report. It could be that you run monthly reports to see how things are tracking. Have we got faster? Have we got slower? Are people declining invitations to review more or less? And then you can also use data to anticipate future behaviors, particularly, I think, with reviewer data. You can look at that and go, there are patterns in the way the reviewers are behaving. So why repeat the same mistakes if you're struggling to find reviewers and they all keep saying no? Maybe there's clues in the data as to why they're saying no. And we'll explore that a little bit. So this is going to be the outline of the presentation today. We'll just do a little bit of theory at first and issues to think about when developing reports before you just leap right into them, which is the first mistake I see people make when they do editorial office reporting. We'll just dwell on a few useful peer review reports. Then we'll explore a few other reports that you might find useful as well, such as usage data, Altmetrics. And then finally, just a quick plea for a need for guidance that I think as an industry we need. Okay, so issues to develop when to consider when you're developing reports. So on the outside, editorial office reporting seems really easy. You define the question you want answering, and you determine the correct data that you need. But there are challenges in that, and it sounds very simple, but it's actually much more complicated than that. We're just going to delve into it now. So the first thing is we deal with messy data. Things aren't recorded accurately. What happens if you're doing a peer review report if you move a manuscript forward and then move it backwards a step? What happens to it then? What happens if you withdraw something? There's just a million different confounders that we have to contend with. And the great thing that you, as an editor or an editorial office professional or a publisher even, can bring to this is that you can bring context, is that you understand that. So like I could look at your data and I can make a number of inferences based on numbers alone, but I don't have the context. I don't know why some things are the way they are. Also, it's important to remember that data doesn't really exist as like a discrete entity. Is that these reports that we use, say Cognos if you're using Scholar One, or enterprise analytic reports if you're using Editorial Manager, for instance, they're relational databases. You're pulling, connecting this to that to the other, and if you don't make the right connection, or you ask the question in a slightly imprecise way, you might not be getting the results that that are either correct or that you're expecting. In some cases, it doesn't mean that you're actually incorrect. It just means that you've answered the question the way that you framed it. And that's fine, as long as you're clear as to how you framed it. And that's why I say subtly change a question, and then this is the important point, the inclusion criteria as to what you include can really make a difference. And I think, to me, the classic one that I always see, if you want to understand this point, is turnaround time to initial decision. And do you include or exclude all the immediate decisions? Because that makes a big difference as to your turnaround time. I personally exclude them because I want to measure how long full peer review took. But maybe there's a case to say that you include them. It doesn't mean one's right and one's wrong, it just means they're different. You're asking two different questions, really. Another thing that I really want people, and I put this at the top, even though it's maybe not the most important thing, but I want people to start thinking about this more when they do reporting, is to consider the spread of data. That's the measures of variance that can actually show how consistent you are. So typically when I see, whatever the field, whatever the publisher, whatever the journal, they typically give the mean turnaround time to something or other. And that's it. There's no standard deviation. Or if they give the median, they never give the interquartile range. So that's great. I know how you did. And maybe if I've got several years worth of data, I can go back and see how you did against other years. But I don't really see how the results that made that number are distributed. Maybe your turnaround time came down simply because you had a bunch of manuscripts that were super, super fast. But the rest of it was as bad as it always was. So it's always important to show distribution. And I know that this scares a lot of people when we start talking about this kind of stuff, particularly if you're not statistically inclined, but you can generate these very easily in Excel. And quite often, even if you don't, I don't really claim to understand standard deviations that much. I know they plot on a bell curve, but at the end of the day, a lot of our editors do know. And so feel free to, put that out there. You might not understand it, but they could probably make sense of it. Now, I also am a big fan of us in the editorial office using medians rather than means. I think medians are much better with the messy data we have. Why do we have messy data? Well, like I said, sometimes we're reversing papers, we're pulling things and putting them somewhere else. But the other thing is that sometimes we have papers that just run incredibly long for whatever reason. Maybe they're being held for a special issue. Maybe there's an ethical issue, and it's just sat there. So medians can help account for those, those few outliers that you have. But if you do a median, make sure that you report the interquartile range, which again is super easy to calculate in Excel. It takes 2 seconds to do. And if you want to try and visualize this is a box plot. And I pulled this from Origin reports, but you can generate these easily enough as well. So what we have here is this line here is the median value, and this is turnaround time to initial decision. And so you can see, it was a bit faster in 2021. It was a little slower. It was 30, 29, 28, and 33. But this is the interquartile range. So my third quartile starts at 43 days, and my first quartile ends at 17 days. So what you can see here is that the distribution of all the results was actually much narrower in 2020. So we were pretty consistent, but we were a little slower than the following year. The following year was quicker, but we were a little more distributed. Now, what happened, I would argue here, is we can see is that we had a lot of papers that started to move through faster. Everything else was still the same. If it didn't get done in that first week or so, it was then typically taking as long as it probably ever did. But the median was dragged down, so it looks good on paper, but really because we had a bunch of papers that were doing well, but we're pushing them through quickly. This up here, by the way, if you're not really familiar with box plot, is the maximum value. So the slowest paper in 2021 took 73 days. I love this. It's a great visual shortcut to show how well performing, be it tracking peer review turnaround times or regular turnaround times for your decisions. Another critical thing to bear in mind is the inclusion criteria. Decide what it is you're going to include, and then, this is so important, write it down, okay? So that we know about it in future. And I'll dwell on that point again in a minute. But again, just think very carefully about what it is you want to include or exclude. So with turnaround times, obviously immediate decisions, you might want to exclude. But then you maybe also want to exclude certain article types as well, because perhaps letters to the editor behave very differently than, say, a systematic review that's going through your peer review system. So, again, there's no definitive answer to what you do. Just be consistent in what you do. Decide on what it is you're going to do, and then be consistent, and then document it for posterity. The worst thing that happens is that you come back a year later and go, I have no idea how I got those figures. I can't remember what I did. Probably because what happened is you took a few manuscripts out for a reason that was maybe valid, but you didn't write it down. Now you can't remember why you got the numbers that you did. It's particularly frustrating if somebody new comes in and they try to replicate what went on before and they cannot figure out. So they have to start all over again. That's what I recommend when I've taken over editorial offices. I just go back and rerun the data from the beginning, because nobody's ever written down what it is that they did. Also important, record the report name. If you're using one of the main editorial management systems, actually document the name of the report that you use to pull the data, because sometimes the numbers can be different. So, for instance, if you want to get some information on reviewers, you might get a different result if you're reporting on total reviewer performance, or reporting from the manuscript data. So the reviewer data is different from the manuscript data, and you just need to, again, it's not to saying that one is right and one is wrong. You just need to stick with it and don't change it the following year, because you will get very different results. And then any comparison you do is not fair or accurate. Finally, know your audience. So think about that. If you're presenting at an editorial board meeting, tables are great, but sometimes they contain a lot of information and a trend isn't always obvious. So I'm a big fan of, if you can put a visual shortcut in, then do it. Your job is to bring analysis and context and comparisons. And, you might not know statistics very well. You might struggle to explain a standard deviation, but you know what happened at that journal over the last year, and you can report back on that, and say, well, we had these bunch of special papers that we handled in a special way. Well, that then affected the data if you didn't exclude them. So, have confidence in yourself. You can bring more to the table than you probably realize. And again, visualize the data and think about ways that you can make shortcuts that will help people interpret things. I'm going to give you an example now. I had an editor that used to hate the table I presented every year that was telling the breakdown of what happened to decisions, initial decisions. And so there was a bunch of immediate manuscripts, decisions that I talked about, and then there was what happened in peer review. So he and I actually came up with this little visual shortcut, which was much easier to understand than a table. Total number of original submissions, immediate manuscripts, the red was rejected, and these were immediately accepted for whatever reason. Everything else then went into peer review, and then this is what happened after that. For the 43% were rejected, 56% were revised, and a couple were accepted. Again, just a nice, simple visual shortcut. If you've got 30 seconds at an editorial board meeting, I love this kind of thing. Yeah, and again, just bring data to life with context. And then also understand that you have to report everything. Don't just be judicious in what you report. If you just want to tell a positive story, maybe you narrow the time frame, or maybe you expand it. If whatever if you know the data like that, that's really cheating your own understanding, and certainly the people that the audience that you're delivering your presentation to. And again, just be consistent in how you present. So let's look at a few peer review reports that you could usefully maybe tweak in the future if you do something basic, or just basically understand what it is that we're trying to report on. So let's start with what ostensibly seems the most simple thing of all: submissions. How many submissions did you receive? Well, I always thought for the first 20 years of my career that was pretty straightforward. Count the number of submissions that came in. But then somebody pointed out to me that some journals actually do it differently, and that you actually only count it once you've checked the manuscript in. So let's say you have a manuscript that maybe is missing some tables. So you send it back to the authors, and then the authors never send the paper back to you. So, if you do the count, everything that was submitted, that's going to be different from everything that you submitted, everything that you checked in under that scenario. Everything that's submitted, everything checked in, they can be different numbers. So it's actually important to define what it is you're counting. And every report, first, the way I approach it, whether it's submissions, reviews, whatever it is, I define what it is that I want to report. And then I determine the comparison data, so what's meaningful. And typically I try to do 5 years, mainly because a lot of the data just becomes either old or and maybe not relevant, or maybe there's too much data, and it's just too much to handle. Of course, the problem that we all have right now is that COVID has really made a mess of the data. So particularly for submissions, they went through the roof in 2020 and to some extent in 21. And so, you have to, maybe you've got to elongate your reporting period just to try and get accurate data. And again, that's when I say provide context. COVID is a classic example. But also, be alert to other things. Maybe there was a huge push for special issue papers, and that might have changed, what was going on. I had one journal that offered 50 free waivers as an open access journal. Well, that year, as you can imagine, the number of submissions went through the roof. I think if you're doing reporting on submissions, think about granularity as well. So, break it down, not just, total number of submissions. Think about geography, where are they from, article type, maybe author characteristics and subject taxonomy. All of these things are things that you can break down. You can do that using the reports that all the major systems provide. You can also run a pivot table in Excel. If you don't know pivot tables, I strongly recommend you go away and watch a couple of YouTube videos on using pivot tables in Excel. They're just fantastic if Excel is the tool that you use to do your reporting. And then finally, just think about the presentation. And I think bar charts are useful, or maybe a donut or a pie chart to show proportions. If you want to show percentage change, maybe use a line chart for that. So here's a couple of examples. I'm just going to so here's your basic bar chart and total number of submissions. It's a monolithic reporting of everything that was received. Here, I broke it down slightly. What I showed here was, again, the height of the columns reflects the total number of submissions. So 2020 had the most number of submissions in this example. But then I segmented the data below that to show the what broke down into that. So I know 101 of the 206 papers in 2020 were review articles. I then also show the proportion as well. So you can see the scale, and you can see the makeup of those total number of submissions. You can also do 100% stacked bar chart as well. I'm a big fan of that to show changes in the proportion of submissions. So I can see the black at the bottom there is brief communications, which is an article type. And I can see that they really dropped off last year, and which may explain why the total number of submissions were down as well. But proportionally, they dropped. And I seem to be getting more reviews, which actually is something that the journal actually wanted in this case. Okay, so let's move on to reporting on reviewers, okay? So again, define reviewers. What do you mean by that? Are they ad hoc reviewers? Are they editorial board members? Are they statistical reviewers or patient reviewers? And, sometimes I use flags, user flags, to help segment them. Sometimes systems are set up in a way that you actually have specifically labeled them, these different types. But I think it is important to break them out, because an editorial board member may be under a contract or an understanding that they're going to deliver a certain number of reviews in a year. So they're more likely to say yes. They might be more likely to turn it around more quickly than an ad hoc reviewer. Ad hoc reviewers are just people that just randomly asked. A statistical reviewer has a very specific role to perform. So, if you're reporting on all reviewers, you may want to exclude the statistical reviewers from your overall total. Same with patient reviewers. I don't know how they behave at your journal if you have them, but they may be something to study in isolation and then see how they affect the overall reporting. Key issues to think about when reporting with reviewers are things like the conversion rate. That's the percentage of invitations to review into agreements to review. A variant of that is the percentage of invitations to review that actually lead to a review. You want to report on turnaround time. Maybe you can report on quality and timeliness, depending on how your system records that or how you record that internally. Another thing that I think we can increasingly look at are reviewer demographics. And a number of journals now are collecting demographic information in a much more enriched way. At the very basic level, you can certainly report on the geography of reviewers, and I think that's important. One of the things that I've seen across literally hundreds of journals through my work at Origin Editorial, and I see a real disproportion between the number of authors that are based in North America and Europe and the number of reviewers that go with that. So like they are looking at the reviewers from North America and Europe are looking at a higher number of papers than reviewers from Asia. So classic example, I have one journal right now, 35% of the papers are from Asia, but only 10% of the reviewers are from Asia. And so that's something that journal has to address. But that's what I mean. Delve down into that sort of geographic data and start taking a look. If you are getting a lot of papers from a certain part of the world and your reviewer base doesn't reflect that, then you may have a growing problem. You may find more willing reviewers in that part of the world because maybe the papers speak to folks in whatever the part of the world is that you have this issue that's ongoing. Again, provide context when it comes to the reviewers. And I think the context when you talk about reviewers are things like reviewer behavior linked to article type or subject matter. Certain subject domains within a larger subject, they just review slower for whatever reason. Maybe basic science goes much slower than surgery at a general journal. Maybe certain article types, it takes longer to review a systematic review than it does a case study. You might want to think about that. So, you can give your big monolithic turnaround time figure, but then you might want to segment it into, let's look at these sort of things. You might want to look at your reminder policies. How often are you reminding people? Or, are you doing sort of engagement with reviewers? If you're training early career reviewers, track their performance over time. Maybe they do a better job at turning things around or agreeing to review because they're more engaged with you. These are all things that, anything that, if you launch a program, a training program, figure out how you can report on them. Because you probably will see patterns in the data as a result, certainly if it works. And then, typically, again, line charts and tables should work for presentation. So, this is a simple documentation of how long it took to convert, the conversion rate. So the invitations to review into agreements to review. And, you could do it as a table. I find that the chart just gives me a little bit more of a visual shortcut. If you want to get a little more complex, I generated in Excel. This shows you how you can sometimes take data and make policy decisions from it. I had an editor a few years ago that was insistent that we do away with reminder emails to reviewers because he felt that they never ever opened them and they just ignored them. So what I did is I plotted on the x-axis is the number of days and the y-axis is the frequency, the amount of times that I observed this happening. And I looked at, and these lines here, by the way, are the reminders. So I had a reminder at 7 days, 11 days, and at 14 days, that was the deadline. This is the number of reviews that were returned on a given day. Well, you see a little pattern. Every time a reminder went out, I had a trend, the upward trend in the people that returned their reviews. Even after the fact, it's really drops off. I'm not getting more reviews. Then I send a reminder out and up it goes. And okay, it was only a few manuscripts in this case. But I think it was pretty conclusive proof that the reminders did work. So, fine, we'll adjust the schedule and monitor this. But this is data this was from a Scholar One journal. I just pulled that out. I just looked at the time that every reviewer took to return a review, and I just plotted it out. And then we made a policy decision based on it. Okay, so reporting on editors. Well, again, define the editors, the associate editors that you're looking at. A specialist editor, again, it could be a statistical editor. Maybe it's someone who looks at only a certain type of paper, and maybe you want to exclude them. Sometimes I exclude if I'm looking at recommendations, if the associate editors make a recommendation, then the EIC makes a decision, I exclude the EIC from that calculation because, frequently they've taken over an abandoned paper, or they've handled special papers for whatever reason, and but you could include them, you could exclude them. What I'm saying is that just define precisely what it is. Don't just say editors. Actually define what type of editor it is and what they're doing. Are they recommending? Are they making a decision? Report on that. Key issues to look at. I'd say that when you're looking at editors, the total number of manuscripts that they worked on, their rejection rates, their time to make a decision, and interestingly, I think the number of reviewers that they picked and secured. So, you'll find that some editors pick a very small number of reviewers, and maybe they've got a fast turnaround time because they keep going to the same people and it's working. That could be a problem because there could be burnout over time. It could be that we're only hearing certain voices. It could also be an advantage, and that they found it's a very niche field. They found everyone, and everyone's agreed to chip in and help. Equally, just because somebody's picked a lot of reviewers, that could be a positive and a negative. One is the positive is they're spreading the wealth and making sure that as many people as possible get a chance to review. The problem could also be that they're really struggling to find reviewers, and that a high number of reviewers is indicative of them struggling, which is why the next bit, context, is critical, is that you in the editorial office, or you as the editor, will probably know what's going on. You will know, oh, that's an editor that probably is struggling. So that number indicates that they might be struggling. Or if you don't know that initially, the number is the signpost to say, I'm going to go look into this. And then, you quickly develop the context behind that number. So the numbers alone should never be used to judge someone. Numbers without context are meaningless. And then again, when I talk about context, you might want to talk about this variance in decision-making criteria across subject matter, because some journals are very broad. And so I mentioned before about basic science and, say, surgery all inside one journal. Those are very different realms of a field. And so, it might be ridiculous to make a comparison between the basic science editors and the surgical editors. That's an unfair comparison. You need to look at the demographics of the editors themselves, their career experience, maybe their prominence. Somebody who's incredibly prominent in the field, a very powerful figure, people are more likely to say yes to them than someone who's, just out of their postdoc and, is unknown outside their own little geographic realm. There are many different ways to report on editors, and I'm going to show you one now. This is one of my favorite things I've created, is a bubble chart and to complete with a table. So what am I showing here is that, again, the x-axis is the days from assignment to initial decision. This is the mean for these editors over here. And then this is the percentage rejection rate. And then the size of the bubble was the number of papers they handled. Now, this is a very small journal, but this particular editor here handled the most papers at 6. That they typically made their decisions in, well, it was 16 days, so we can see that they're over here. And their rejection rate is 67%, so they're quite high. You can divide this into quadrants, and then this is why I like it. It's a nice visual shortcut when you've got a lot of editors as to which ones are maybe not performing well. So the ones I've defined not performing well, if you want to have a fairly high rejection rate and a quick turnaround time, are going to be people in this bottom quadrant, because they're taking a long time to do to get to their initial decisions, and they're not rejecting at a particularly high rate, at less than 50%. So another thing that you could do with editors is deliver something called normative feedback, and some of you are probably very familiar with it. Others aren't. You will have come across this before. It'll be, this is you, and this is your peers, and here's the data. So what you might do in an editorial office is say, this is the mean turnaround time across all the manuscripts to initial decision, and this is your time. And then, this is how you rank relative to all your colleagues. And you can plot that in various ways. I did that here. You can see this is the number of editors is on the y-axis. And, so like most of the editors were fairly good at what they were doing. This particular editor, they're highlighted here with this line. Well, they fell over here a little bit. So most of the editors are a little better than them. Normative feedback is good because psychologists have looked at this a lot, and they find that it's just a great motivator for people. People don't like to be at the back here. They don't like to be the slowest, but they also need to know You know, if it's not a case of they're motivated by being a competitive thing, they're not motivated to be the fastest. They just need context for how they're performing. Okay, I seem to be doing all right. That seems to be what the journal wants. Okay, so we're almost into the final stretch, which is just talking about non-peer review reports. So the final ones I just wanted to mention are about decisions. Again, define what the decisions are that you want to report, and if there's anything you want to exclude, particularly if you're talking about timings. Things that you might want to report on are decision ratios, turnaround times, maybe the influence of associate editors. So, you know, if you have certain associate editors that are very hard, and then the editor-in-chief is having to correct that hardness, maybe that, you know, it was reject and they say minor revision or a major revision or something like that. You know, these are things that you can monitor using the data, but again, just define what the key issues are that you want to report on. And the context it would be things like the time frame, variance by article types, whether content was commissioned. If it's commissioned, you're probably handling it differently. Maybe there's an expectation it will eventually be accepted. So you might have rejected the paper if it was just unsolicited. If it's commissioned, you're probably going to work with it. Also provide information on how outline papers were handled. You know, if what did you do with them in the end? Why were they outliers in the first place? So there are different ways that you can report on that, but the way that I like to really report is to give detailed information, and you could break it down by decisions by decision type, and I'm sure all of you have done this kind of thing, and you might also put percentages in here as well. This is just the actual numbers. I like to use pivot tables, and here's a pivot table that I generated. So maybe I want to segment my information down. So this is great. I know in this particular case how many major revisions I had. But maybe once I then do a pivot table, I can find out who was contributing to these major revisions. These are the editor names. And I can see over time as well how many they were doing for major revisions. So this is useful information. It's granularity that you can go with this headline data, but a simple pivot table will give you that bit more information that you can then work with. This will tell you, are certain editors behaving a certain way, and is that warping your data, skewing your data in a particular direction. Okay, so some other useful reports. And again, like I said, these slides are available afterwards, and please feel free to follow up with me if you have any questions on what you see. So I think there are other things that we don't use enough on as editors or in the editorial office, and we could derive a lot more meaning from them if we use them. So usage data is a classic one I see. And some of that's a function of the fact that over the years, the publishers haven't done a great job in reporting on usage data. Certainly in the earlier days, they changed how they recorded information, how they reported it. They didn't change what they did with crawlers once they figured out that was skewing the data. So I think the data settled down in recent years. There seems to be much more uniformity in how it's presented. So let's start looking at what sort of papers are generating what sort of usage. Now, at the end of the day, it's not about a popularity contest. That's not why we're publishing journals. But there are clues as to, is that what your readers are responding to? If a paper really takes off, that suggests that it had appeal beyond your reader base. Well, then that should maybe, if you're publishing that kind of material again in the future, or that author, or that subject matter, whatever, think about how you could maybe gear your marketing around that article level marketing. Maybe you do an outreach to a community that's, tangential to the field. Maybe if you commission a paper, you take someone from your field and someone from that field and bring them together, and that might help boost your usage. I think it's important, usage is important for looking at what authors seem to generate attention. Now, you will know some of the main authors in your field, but sometimes there's the up-and-comers and their material is taking off, and the usage data is an early indicator of that. There are other things that we really want to dwell on with usage data. If you care about advertising at your journal, that's something that's really important because advertisers do look at usage. So maybe, you're under pressure to make sure that you're publishing articles that are widely read and not highly esoteric things, because that's going to help drive, future advertising sales. You can have your opinion on that. I'm just saying that is something that some people do. You can also determine if your readership is shifting geographically as well. So is your journal that you think, it's based in North America, most of your editors are North American, but your readership is predominantly European, then maybe that's something that you need to address. Okay. And then also look at things like how are things like open access or free access or social media promotion, how are they affecting usage data? Marketing throughout most of my career, which is now, up to 30 years pretty much in publishing, was always about getting subscriptions in the early days. Now it's about readership and it's about the author as the customer. That's critical. And usage data is going to be a key part, a weapon in your armory to figure out who the authors are that you need to be recruiting or retaining. So if you've had an author that's done well in the past, why don't you let them know that fact? And particularly if you're going to ask them in the future for other materials. Maybe that was a one-off thing that they sent to your journal, but it really resonated with your readers. Well, tell them that. And then, you use the usage data to tell them that. There are limits to the usage data. Individual journals can only compare performance really against themselves. If you're part of a portfolio of journals, you can do that. But you don't know what your rival journals are doing, so you never got complete clarity as to how content is behaving. The data that's provided isn't always granular enough, but I would recommend you talk with whoever provides your data, be it your publisher or wherever you get it from, and just look at, is there more granularity that can be obtained? Feel free to go back and ask questions. I find that most publishers don't mind if you ask them something, can you give me more refined data on this? This is an interesting pattern that we're seeing here. There isn't much guidance on how to interpret it. So, what is a download? What is it when what's a unique, viewer? All of these kind of things, or unique visits, that kind of stuff. I still think that there's some gray area around what those things actually represent. And of course, are all readers of equal value? I have one particular journal that I've worked on now for 20 years, the Journal of Sexual Medicine. Well, as you can imagine, some things in that journal really take off, and the news media go bonkers over the article. I once had an article that was on David Letterman's show. It ended up being part of his monologue. Well, of course, readership went through the roof, but that wasn't really meaningful readership at the end of the day. Altmetrics, I think, can be used in association with usage data. So I just wanted to dwell on them. And I don't know, maybe you do, maybe you don't have access to the Altmetric Explorer, which is the sort of the background tool that you can track articles. I think it's a really useful tool. I use it a lot. And this is coming from someone that doesn't really do social media at all. But failing that, depending on who you publish with, a lot of the publishers will have the donut against the article, and then you can click on the donut and find out more, about who's mentioning your paper. And Altmetrics are useful because you can track high-performing articles in real time, and in turn you can further boost visibility. So if you see an article that's immediately taking off, going viral, or whatever the phrase is on social media, you can amplify that even more by doing another push. Maybe your social media editor can do a bit of a boost. Look at who's commenting on it and try and convert them into followers. Use the altmetric data to build profiles for articles that generate attention. And attention is useful. It's not, attention could potentially lead to citations. I know that the younger generation of researchers, they are looking at altmetrics. My wife is a researcher. I know that when the day an article is published, she's looking at that altmetric donut all day to see if the article's taking off or not. There's been speculation that things like the Mendeley saves are possible a future indicator of an indicator of future citations, because it's a reference manager. People are like, oh, I'll put that in Mendeley for future reference. And altmetric, as you saw on this donut, does record the number of Mendeley saves. Now, I can tell you now that, because this is from an article that I wrote on predatory journals a few years ago with a bunch of people, and I know it's been highly cited, and actually the citation number is not far off that Mendeley number. Okay, we're almost at the end. Just a couple more things. Reporting isn't always about going into the system and getting a report generated from Cognos or Enterprise Analytic Reports or whatever. It's not about going to the publisher and asking for data that they may have captured, citation information, or whatever else that they can get hold of dimensions, that kind of stuff. You can also categorize and tabulate stuff yourself. And one of the things that I always get the Origin team to do is to document all the correspondence that comes in from authors. Could it be how many requests that you had for what's happened to the status of my manuscript, or people asking, do I need to include this with a submission? All of that sort of stuff is important. Why? Well, because if you get authors that don't seem to understand something about your submission process, you can tally that up, document it, see that it's a problem, and then do something about it. Either change the system, change your instructions, or do some sort of outreach and education campaign. Look at and track the number of times that if you have an ingesting QC checklist, like you're checking for things, or a missing parts checklist when you're checking a manuscript in, document all the things that we're missing, and then tally that up over time and see if authors are frequently missing that you want your abstracts to be structured in a certain way, then clearly you need to do some work upstream to stop that being a problem if it's then a problem for you later. So collate and code your data, and you can do that with reviewer comments as well. That's more sophisticated maybe, and you might need to get subject experts in. And I did this a few years ago actually with a couple of subject experts, where we actually looked at the main reasons for rejection. We went through reviewer comments and just coded what were the problems. So I'm going to show you an example of that in a minute. So just to illustrate my first point, this is an example for a calendar month at one particular journal that Origin runs, and these were the communication emails that we received. So clearly, if we've got 6 emails about copyrights inside a month, we need to do a better job at communicating about copyrights. When it comes to reasons for rejection, these were the things that we found. We sat there and tabulated it. We reviewed a whole bunch of them, saw what were the main problems, and then started to tabulate it after that. Finally, a need for guidance. Reporting is challenging, and it could be challenging because we're not sure what is the correct data to report on, or what is the best method to tell a story. We've had almost no training in how to do this. And we don't always know if we're reporting on the best thing, if we're asking the question in the most optimal way, and we've got no comparisons to which to do other than our own historic data, and that might be flawed simply because we don't know how it was reported on in the past. And I'm going to make a plea that EASE is a perfect organization to do this, that we start to put out some guidance on reporting on things like what to include, what to exclude, appropriate statistical reporting, when and how to use comparisons, and the effective documenting of the parameters, the things that you included and excluded. And I think if we can do that, we can actually achieve a lot more with the journals that we have. We'll understand how we can report better, and there's so much more information that lie at our fingertips, and do much more with that information to maybe, as I said, authors are customers, to recruit authors, to improve the service that we deliver, to engage better with reviewers. All of these things are things that stories that we can tell with the data that we have at our fingertips. So thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Well, we do have a perfectly segueing question from Janine Botos in the Q&A, and she asked, is there a best practice set of reports, which is a very timely and apt question, because we are in the very early stages of working on addressing that very question.
Yeah. Thanks for that question, Janine. I know Janine, and I know that she's one of the most thoughtful people that work in journal publishing and the editorial offices. So it is something that we need to do just to really help people, because it's like, at a number of the top journals, they've got it all figured out, but there are realms and realms of journals that really don't know what they're doing. And I think there's a lot that we can do to help, and ISMTE and EASE are perfect organizations to deliver something practical. That's what we need. It's not just theory, we need practical information and help.
And I think if we can kind of turn that into a question back for the audience while we maybe talk about some other things. If we did have a best practice set of reports, or you were to contribute your best practice report, what would those be? I think that's probably a good way to start. Or one of the many ways of starting this kind of thing is asking people what reports that you run that you find most useful. From your presentation, Jason, I really love the visual indicators of where people's reminders are sent for the review requests to very clearly. I mean, there is no clearer indication of whether they work or not. It'd be quite good as well to see a journal where the reminders don't work for comparison, so you can see. But that's a very clear chart that that helps with that. I myself, I've got a report that I call Friends of the Journal, where I combine review requests and reviews completed with the number of papers people have authored, not just the contact author, but anyone in the author list as well. Add those numbers together to see which people are kind of contributing and supporting the journal a lot, and you can go kind of wild with that as well, adding in citations, Altmetrics scores to people's activity, and really see who is sort of very active around the journal community. Eva has stopped me from talking. Thank you, Eva. Who is generating reports? Do you have an option to pull them out of the submission system? Otherwise, it is a lot of work for the editor. Eva, they're asking for a PA for every editor in the industry.
Yeah. Well, that's true. It is, I mean, the publishers should be, if you have a publisher, they will do the reporting sometimes. I don't find it particularly sophisticated. I mean, for instance, they'll give you the turnaround time and it includes everything and that's not useful. I saw one major publisher that always used to give out standard reports because I saw several journals and they never put the numbers at the top of the columns. So I could see the pattern, but I didn't actually know the precise number. So yeah, it is useful if you can have a PA. I do have that system, Origin Reports. It's like you build the reports once, extracts data from the main submission systems, and then you can design your own reports and you literally just feed in new data and it'll output that time. So for instance, that bubble chart I showed you before, I just run that once a month. I just feed in new data, click the button, and it's done. It takes a little bit of time, a couple of hours to set up the reports initially, and then it's done. But otherwise, yes, unfortunately, it is you need an editorial assistant to help.
I mean, the editorial manager, Scholar One, eJournal Press as well, I think, or maybe lots of the big systems have scheduled reports. So once you can commit the time to creating your reports and actually have them automatically send them to you. And if you want to get extra fancy, you can have them send them to an FTP site and have a system automatically ingest that into a report builder. I've done that for some people. So the whole thing kind of works in the background and you just go and visit the report and it's completely refreshed and updated to the recent set. But there's kind of things that you can do, technical things to reduce some of the manual efforts out of the process. Mary asked in the chat, how often are most editors-in-chief reporting to their boards or publishers? Is it once a year or more often?
That's a really good question. I think it is like the how long is a piece of string question, but I mean, at a minimum, it's once a year. I've worked with editors of all stripes, and I find that quarterly reporting is usually adequate for the big summary stuff. Monthly, if you meet monthly, great, then you can report monthly. Of course, then there's a time commitment to generating those reports, unless you do one of the things that we've just been talking about. But at the very least, I would recommend that if you're an editor or in the editorial office, you do your own reporting. Don't rely on the publishers. And that's not to knock the publishers. They're doing their best. But I think you've got the context to then go back at that data and go, well, I maybe do need to exclude all of that. Publishers don't have that. So they're just going to give you raw numbers. Equally, if you just like the raw numbers that I know like Scholar One produces, they're completely meaningless because there's no context to them. So it'll tell you your turnaround time is 16 days. Well, I know that's not true. It's only because we immediately reject 70% of the papers. But full peer review probably takes about 40 or 50 days. That's the number I want to get to. So then I have to do the reports that get me that information. But I do recommend that you do, when you do report back to your editorial board, that you do give them the normative feedback. I've started doing that in the last few years, and it's been huge. I don't make a big deal of it. I casually just slip the information to them, and I don't do a general chart that everyone can see how they ranked. I just give them the normative feedback, and they can go away and dwell on it in private.
Victoria said in the chat, her reports are once, sometimes twice a year to everyone, monthly or quarterly to strategic tier of board members, the smaller group of the decision, the steering editors.
One of the things to consider when you do the sort of reporting to boards, you want feedback on this, and also anticipate additional questions, and that's what you really do want. So a pattern might leap out to one of your editors. Well, okay, something's happening here. We're seeing a trend coming from this part of the world, and that's a chance for you to go back and investigate. So I never see reporting as definitive. I often see it as the jumping off point to go and explore other things in depth. And that's why you should share widely, because people see things that you might not.
And Eva has asked whether anyone, I guess it's a question for all of us, perhaps, are you publishing these kind of editorial reports in the journal at all, like an editorial report? I know some of the journals I've worked with in the past do, as maybe at the start of the year, as a review of how the journal has gone, for a bit of transparency, a bit of community engagement. But I haven't seen it as a standard across very many journals.
No, I haven't either, Duncan, and I've seen Inside a lot. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that everyone counts things differently. So I'd hate for people to start saying, well, look at those guys over there. I've seen journals that have boasted about their turnaround times, and it's really, I've gone, well, that's no way that's possible. You're including immediate decisions in that. I think what you can do, if you don't share it super publicly like that in an editorial, is at the very least is engage with your reviewers and say, write to them, tell them information. We used this many reviewers last year, and thanks to you guys, we're able to deliver turnaround times of this. You could try that as a form of engagement and marketing at the same time. I'm a big fan of that. And again, like I mentioned that with the usage data, definitely do that, or the Altmetrics. Some authors aren't paying attention to this, but if you can tell them, hey, you were one of my most widely read articles last year. Love it if you could send us something in the future. That's an engagement, and that's ever more critical in this author as customer future that we seem to be facing, particularly if you're at an open access journal.
Victoria in the chat said she's considering trialing sending the pre-board meeting report in a shared document to stimulate more discussion in advance of the meetings, and I guess to forewarn people of content. So seeing things for the first time immediately isn't always the best way of inspiring discussion, because it puts people on the spot a bit too much.
Yeah, Victoria, that's a great idea. That was the mistake I made for years. I'd show up, and of course, back in the day, it was just printed, and I'd just hand it to them, and of course, they're eating their lunch over the editorial board meeting, and nobody's paying attention. So definitely, in advance is good, and good summary slides, but make sure you add that context to it. Don't just hand them over the charts. Make sure you add some context.
And Diane has also asked a good question about, she said she's tried to track the geography of her reviewers, but noticed a lot of missing information in the system. And how is the best way to go about asking people to update their profiles? The managing editors, the journal editors, the publishers, I guess it depends, but how have you found, I guess another way to frame that, Jason, to you, is how have you found addressing missing data in developing reports over time?
Yeah, that's a good question. So again, it depends on who really owns the journal, or so like if it's a publisher, the publisher may have imposed on all of their publisher-owned journals, this is how we're going to do it. But I always find that that's great, but people don't open emails from publishers, but they do open emails from editors a lot more. So it might well be that you have to work in consort with the publisher to get the information that you need, and it could be, we need this information, and here's why. and understand that, maybe a good 40, 50, 60% of people won't ever give you that information. I'm surprised that you don't have geographic information on your reviewers. I don't know what system you use, but like the main systems, if a user account set up, there probably is something about the geography in there. But I get it that that's not always there. You can ask. Certainly, if anyone's ever done a review for you, they're more likely to give you the information that you need. If they've never done anything for you, they're just a potential reviewer, you're probably not going to get that info. And just to finish off that point, think about if you're a society-owned journal, work with the society as well. I mean, they often have a lot of demographic information about the members. And I'm amazed at how often the journal's operating over here and the society's operating over there, and never the twain shall meet. But do work with the society. You might get information out of them as well.
And Ari said in the chat that he shares some of their statistics in their newsletter for peer reviewers and authors, and the editorials are read by a much wider audience, but the general reader may tend to find that information a bit too nerdy to be invested in. I don't know, there's already a lot of us here that would probably I read a lot of articles about editorial activity. We are a collective of nerds. It's for us with a target audience. Does anyone have any other kind of questions or comments or kind of ideas, experiences of the sort of reports that you run or like to run that are well received in your editorial boards, reports? I know certainly actually some of the altmetric data is quite a divisive thing, I find. Some editors are really enthusiastic about seeing that kind of information, and others still consider social media to be somewhat a kind of frivolous. But you can get, like Jason said, there's a lot of more evidence of seeding citations through Altmetrics, and I've seen the thing they've lost a lot of activity with changes to Twitter, particularly, which used to be the kind of venue where so much article activity was tracked, but they lost the API and it's got a bit complicated. So we've got a lot of different social media platforms now, and I think that Altmetric team are looking at incorporating more from things like Blue Sky, Threads, and stuff. So it's not just Twitter, and LinkedIn as well. It's really increasing in activity, and that information has not been in Altmetrics at all. So there's a lot of really useful stuff that's not being tracked yet in Altmetric that you might want to sort of bring it more back on track, that you might want to manually keep a track of if you are active on those platforms. Okay. Any other questions or comments from anyone? Mary's putting lots of information in the chat for everyone about our forthcoming webinars and activities. The February webinar hosted by our Environment and Sustainability Committee on assessing our commitment to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. In February, we have our EASE Awards event as well on the 7th of February. EASE members can cast their votes on several categories for the nominees for those events. We're also starting another edition of our reporting statistics in medicine course. The 4-module course starts in March, which was very well received last time we ran it. And finally, the feedback form for today's session is in the chat. Be very grateful if everyone could fill that in and provide us with your thoughts on the session. Thank you very much for that, Jason. That was, as you said at the beginning, That was a huge amount of information and ideas. Hopefully everyone will be kind of buzzing with the potential of what they're going to deliver their editorial boards in the coming months.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and feel free to reach out to me, anyone that was here today, Jason@origineditorial.com. Thanks, everyone.